The moment President Ibrahim Traoré stood at the United Nations General Assembly podium on that Tuesday morning in September, every diplomat in the room knew something unprecedented was about to happen. He wasn't carrying the usual prepared speech that African leaders typically rate from. Instead, he held a single manila folder and a USB drive that would shake the foundations of the international order. For 70 years, Traoré began his voice cutting through the assembly hall like a blade. The United Nations has kept archives that document every decision, every intervention, every operation in Africa. Today, I demand these archives be open to the African people, and I know you will refuse. The Secretary General shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That's why Traoré continued, pulling out the USB drive. I brought my own copies. The hall erupted. Diplomats who had been checking their phones suddenly looked up. Translators stopped mid-sentence, unsure if they had heard correctly. The Security Council members exchanged panicked glances. How could Burkina Faso's president have copies of classified UN archives? These were documents protected by 7 layers of encryption stored in vaults that required unanimous Security Council approval to access. Documents that supposedly didn't exist in complete form anywhere outside the UN's most secure facilities in Geneva and New York. The story of how Traoré obtained these archives began 6 months earlier when a UN employee named David Cartwright contacted the Burkinabe embassy in Geneva. Cartwright, a 35-year veteran archivist who had spent his entire career cataloging and protecting the UN's most sensitive documents, had discovered something that destroyed his faith in the organization he'd served. While digitizing old records, he had stumbled upon a section labeled Project Sunrise, a systematic documentation of how the UN had been used to maintain colonial control over Africa long after independence. Cartwright's discovery wasn't accidental. He had been searching for records about his grandfather, who had served as a UN official in the Congo during the 1960s and had died under mysterious circumstances. What he found instead was evidence that his grandfather had been eliminated for opposing a UN-sanctioned operation that had resulted in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. But that was just the beginning. The deeper Cartwright dug, the more horrifying the revelations became. The archives contained detailed records of every UN peacekeeping mission that had actually been designed to fail, every humanitarian crisis that had been deliberately prolonged, every development program that had been sabotaged from within. There were transcripts of Security Council meetings where permanent members discussed how to keep African nations dependent. There were signed orders for peacekeepers to stand down during massacres. There were plans to ensure that no African nation would ever become prosperous enough to challenge the global order. The most damning discovery was a document titled the Management Protocol, a 400-page manual created in 1963 that outlined how to use UN mechanisms to control African resources while maintaining the appearance of supporting African development. The protocol detailed how to structure aid to create dependency, how to use peacekeeping forces to protect extraction operations, how to manipulate democratic processes to ensure compliant leaders remained in power. It had been updated every 5 years, with the most recent revision completed just months before Traoré's speech. When Cartwright realized the magnitude of what he had found, he knew he couldn't go through official channels. The UN's whistleblower protections were a joke when it came to exposing the organization itself. Previous employees who had tried to reveal corruption had suffered mysterious accidents, sudden illnesses, or simply disappeared. But Cartwright had something they didn't: complete access to the archives and the technical knowledge to copy them undetected. The operation to extract the archives took 3 months. Cartwright couldn't simply download everything. The system would detect large data transfers. Instead, he had to copy documents piece by piece using a method that made it appear he was performing routine maintenance. He worked at night, during weekends, during holidays, when security was minimal. He stored the data on drives hidden throughout Geneva, never keeping more than fragments in any one location. The psychological toll on Cartwright was immense. Every document he read revealed another atrocity, another betrayal, another crime against humanity committed under the UN flag. He read about refugee camps that were actually detention centers, food aid that was deliberately contaminated to reduce populations, vaccines that were designed to cause infertility. He discovered that several African leaders who had died in plane crashes had been assassinated using UN intelligence. He found evidence that ethnic conflicts had been deliberately instigated to justify interventions. The archive revealed that the UN structure itself was designed for control. The Security Council veto wasn't about preventing conflict. It was about ensuring that the powerful could block any action that threatened their interests. The General Assembly's resolutions were non-binding precisely, so they could be ignored when African nations raised legitimate grievances. The International Court of Justice had sealed rulings that would have required trillions in reparations to Africa. Judgments that were never enforced because the same nations that owed reparations controlled the enforcement mechanisms. When Cartwright finally had complete copies of the most critical archives, he faced the challenge of getting them to someone who could use them. Most African leaders wouldn't dare expose such information. They were either complicit, compromised, or terrified. But Traoré was different. He had already shown willingness to confront powerful interests. And Burkina Faso's position meant he had little to lose and everything to gain from exposing the truth. The handover was arranged through intermediaries who didn't know what they were transferring. The data was encrypted and split across multiple carriers. Cartwright himself never met Traoré directly, maintaining plausible deniability. By the time the UN realized their archives had been compromised, Cartwright had disappeared, leaving behind only a resignation letter that said, "I can no longer serve an organization that has betrayed every principle it claims to uphold." Traoré's team spent months analyzing the archives, verifying their authenticity, and preparing for the moment of revelation. They knew that simply releasing the documents wouldn't be enough. The UN and its powerful members would claim they were forgeries, would flood the media with disinformation, would do everything possible to suppress the truth. The revelation had to be undeniable, public, and impossible to ignore. That's why Traoré chose the General Assembly. Every nation would be watching. The media would be present. The moment would be broadcast live before anyone could cut the feed. He had sent copies of key documents to journalists, academics, and activists worldwide. Time to be released simultaneously with his speech. By the time the UN realized what was happening, it would be too late to stop the cascade of revelations. Standing at the podium, Traoré began presenting the evidence. Document A1-96314. He read Security Council resolution classified, never made public. Quote, "The mineral wealth of Africa must remain accessible to developed nations. Any African government that attempts to nationalize resources should be destabilized through UN mechanisms signed by all permanent members." Gasps echoed through the hall. Document B1-97523. He continued, "Peacekeeping directive for Angola." Quote, "Peacekeepers are to ensure that neither side achieves decisive victory. A prolonged conflict serves our interests by preventing stable governance that might restrict resource extraction. The civil war lasted 27 years. 500,000 died." The Secretary General tried to interrupt, claiming Traoré was violating protocol, but Traoré ignored him. Document C1-947 Rwanda. The UN force commander requested permission to intervene to prevent genocide. The request was denied with this note: "The demographic adjustment in Rwanda may serve long-term stability interests." 800,000 people died while UN peacekeepers were ordered to stand down. The evidence kept coming. Documents showing that the UN had tested biological weapons in refugee camps. Orders to poison water supplies to force population movements. Plans to assassinate African leaders who oppose structural adjustment programs. Records of UN officials trafficking organs from disaster zones. Evidence that food aid had been deliberately withheld to force countries to accept unfavorable trade agreements. Document D20319 Tray subject. Population Control Protocol. Quote, "The African population growth threatens global resource distribution. Recommend continued implementation of fertility reduction programs through vaccination campaigns." These vaccines were administered to millions of African women without their knowledge or consent. The American ambassador stood to leave, but Traoré called out document E21045 CIA liaison report to UN intelligence. Details how the United States used UN cover to conduct drone strikes that killed 3,400 civilians. Would you like me to read the names of the children? Ambassador Harrison. The French ambassador was next. Document F20512 French military operations conducted under UN peacekeeping mandate. 16 coups organized. 43 African leaders assassinated or removed. The UN provided diplomatic cover for every operation. The British representative tried to claim diplomatic immunity to avoid hearing more, but Traoré was relentless. Document G20 2018. British corporations extracted £47 billion in gold from UN-administered territories. The peacekeepers provided security for the operations. Local populations who protested were classified as terrorists. The Chinese delegation attempted to leave quietly, but Traoré had documents for them too. Document H2030. Chinese Belt and Road initiatives coordinated through UN development programs. Debt traps designed to transfer African sovereignty to Beijing. The UN facilitated every predatory loan. The Russian ambassador who had been sitting silently wasn't spared. Document I202115. Russian mercenaries operating under UN contractor status. 4,000 summary executions. The UN paid for these operations through peacekeeping budgets. The most devastating revelations came from documents about the UN's own leadership. Traoré revealed that the last 5 secretaries general had been selected through a secret process controlled by the Permanent Security Council members. Each had signed agreements before taking office pledging to protect certain interests. They were not international civil servants but employees of the powerful nations. Document J201 Traoré. The selection criteria for Secretary General. Court candidates must demonstrate willingness to maintain existing power structures. Any indication of genuine reform intention is grounds for disqualification. Every Secretary General for the past 50 years was chosen because they would not change anything. The archives revealed that the UN's humanitarian agencies were fronts for intelligence operations. UNICEF had been used to gather genetic data from African children for biological weapons research. The World Food Programme had tested genetically modified organisms designed to create food dependency. The WHO had conducted medical experiments that would have been illegal in developed nations. The peacekeeping operations were the most corrupted. The archive showed that peacekeepers were deliberately selected from nations that had economic interests in conflict zones. They were instructed to protect extraction operations, not civilians. Sexual abuse by peacekeepers wasn't a failure of discipline, but a deliberate strategy to demoralize populations. The UN had received 65,000 reports of peacekeeper abuse and had prosecuted fewer than 100 cases. The development programs were designed to fail. Every infrastructure project included provisions that ensured African nations could never maintain them independently. Roads were built with materials that would degrade quickly in African climates. Power plants required parts only available from specific suppliers. Water systems were designed with proprietary technology that required expensive foreign maintenance. Document K20944. Traoré continued, Subject Development Dependency Protocol. Quote, no African nation should achieve technological independence. All development must include mechanisms for continued external control. This is why Africa, despite receiving trillions in aid, remains technologically dependent. The educational initiatives were particularly insidious. The UN had promoted educational curricula that taught African children they were inferior, that their cultures were backward, that they needed foreign guidance. Scholarships were provided to students who showed willingness to serve foreign interests. Those who demonstrated nationalist thinking were blacklisted from opportunities. The archives contain recordings of Security Council meetings where members laughed about African suffering. In one recording, the American representative joked about a famine they had helped create through market manipulation. The British representative suggested that reducing African population would help with climate change. The French representative proposed that keeping Africa poor would ensure continued immigration to provide cheap labor for Europe. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was the existence of the termination protocols. These protocols, updated annually, outline how to use climate change, pandemic disease, and economic collapse to justify placing Africa under direct UN administration. The plans included provisions for forcibly relocating populations, seizing resources under environmental protection mandates, and establishing permanent UN governance structures that would supersede national governments. Document L20233 Traoré. The termination timeline. Phase 1, create dependency through aid complete. Phase 2, destroy traditional governance through conflict in progress. Phase 3, collapse economies through debt. 70% complete. Phase 4, use crisis to justify direct administration scheduled for 2030. The UN's response to these revelations was exactly what the archives had predicted. Document M1-9957 was titled Disclosure Response Protocol and outlined what to do if the archives were ever exposed. Step 1, deny authenticity. Step 2, claim documents are out of context. Step 3, announce internal investigation that will never report findings. Step 4, wait for news cycle to move on. Step 5, continue operations with minor cosmetic changes. But Traoré had anticipated this. He had brought not just documents but video recordings, audio files, and signed originals with DNA evidence. He had witnesses ready to testify, former UN employees who had participated in these operations and were now willing to speak. He had financial records showing money transfers, operational budgets, and payment receipts for assassinations and coups. The Secretary General, Thomas Anderson, finally stood and attempted to regain control. These allegations are serious and will be investigated, he said, following the script exactly as the protocol dictated. But Traoré had the protocol, too. And he read it aloud, showing that even this response was pre-planned, that even the investigation was designed to fail. Your investigation committee, Trudeau said, reading from document in 2019, will consist of representatives from the same nations that committed these crimes. It will take 3 years to report. The report will acknowledge minor procedural violations while denying systematic wrongdoing. Compensation will be limited to symbolic gestures. No individual will be held accountable. The legal implications of the archives were staggering. Every UN intervention in Africa for 70 years was potentially criminal. Every peacekeeping operation could be prosecuted as a war crime. Every development program could be sued for fraud. The liability wasn't just moral, but legal and financial. The documents provided evidence for thousands of potential prosecutions and lawsuits that could bankrupt the UN and its member states. The archives also revealed the existence of secret UN facilities across Africa, underground bunkers that housed weapons, laboratories that developed biological agents, communication centers that monitored all African telecommunications. These facilities built with peacekeeping funds were actually colonial infrastructure maintaining foreign control over Africa through hidden means. Document 02877 Traoré read location of UN Special Facilities 16 Biological Research Laboratories 23 Weapons Depots 41 Intelligence Stations 12 Detention Centers that don't officially exist. All operational, all illegal, all on African soil without any African government's knowledge. The human experimentation documented in the archives was reminiscent of the worst atrocities in history. African populations had been used to test everything from psychological warfare techniques to genetic modification. Entire communities had been subjected to experiments without their knowledge. Diseases had been deliberately spread to study transmission patterns. Children had been subjected to educational experiments designed to test indoctrination techniques. The economic manipulation was equally shocking. The UN had coordinated with international financial institutions to ensure that African currencies remained weak, that African stock markets could be easily manipulated, that African trade was always disadvantageous. Every economic crisis in Africa for the past 50 years had been either created or exacerbated by UN policies. Document P 2022-101. Traoré continued, Economic Subjugation Framework. The UN coordinates with the IMF, World Bank, and WTO to ensure that Africa remains economically subordinate. Currency manipulations, trade barriers, and debt structures are synchronized to prevent African economic independence. The environmental crimes were extensive. The UN had approved the dumping of toxic waste in Africa while publicly promoting environmental protection. They had allowed foreign corporations to destroy African ecosystems while blaming local populations for environmental damage. Climate change funds meant for Africa had been diverted to protect the interests of polluting nations. The cultural destruction was systematic. The UN had promoted the erasure of African languages, traditions, and knowledge systems. They had funded programs that portrayed African culture as primitive while promoting Western values as universal. They had deliberately destroyed African confidence and identity to make exploitation easier. Document Q2567. Traoré, Cultural Subordination Strategy. African pride and identity are obstacles to resource extraction. Recommended approach. Promote shame about African identity. Glorify foreign culture. Create aspirations that can only be met through dependency. The religious manipulation was particularly cynical. The UN had funded religious movements that promoted submission and acceptance of suffering while suppressing those that encouraged resistance and self-determination. They had used religion as a tool of control, promoting interpretations that justified exploitation as divine will. The archives revealed that several pandemics had been either created or allowed to spread in Africa as population control measures. Vaccines had been withheld until populations reached manageable levels. Medical research conducted on African populations had resulted in treatments that were then made available only in developed nations. Document our 2019-29 True presented Pandemic Management Protocol for Africa. Allow initial spread to reduce population pressure. Provide limited intervention to prevent complete collapse. Use crisis to justify increased foreign control. Extract biological data for medical research. The archives contain lists of African leaders, activists, and intellectuals who had been targeted for elimination. Next to each name was a date, a method, and a result: plane crashes, sudden illnesses, accidents, suicides, all orchestrated by UN intelligence in coordination with foreign services. The list included some of Africa's most promising leaders, people who might have changed the continent's trajectory. The educational sabotage went beyond curriculum. The UN had deliberately provided substandard educational materials to Africa, textbooks with errors, equipment that didn't work, teachers who weren't qualified. They had created an education system designed to produce workers, not thinkers, servants, not leaders. Document S2088. Traoré. Educational Limitation Guidelines. African education should produce individuals capable of following instructions, but not of innovation. Critical thinking should be discouraged. History should be taught to induce shame rather than pride. The technology transfer restrictions were absolute. The archive showed that the UN had actively prevented technology transfer to Africa, ensuring that the continent remained dependent on imports for everything from medicine to machinery. Any attempt by African nations to develop independent technological capacity was sabotaged through UN mechanisms. The media manipulation was comprehensive. The UN had funded media organizations that promoted negative images of Africa while suppressing positive stories. They had created a narrative of African helplessness that justified continued intervention. They had paid journalists to write stories that supported exploitation while attacking those who exposed truth. The psychological warfare operations were sophisticated. The UN had conducted massive psychological operations designed to break African confidence, create internalized inferiority, and promote dependency. These operations used everything from education to entertainment to create Africans who would accept exploitation as natural. Document T202156. Traoré revealed psychological subjugation program target African self-perception method constant reinforcement of inferiority narratives goal create populations that believe they need external management. The archive showed that the UN had been planning for the eventual exposure of these documents. They had contingency plans that included everything from martial law to manufactured crisis that would distract from revelations. They had even considered eliminating entire populations if necessary to protect their secrets. As Traoré presented document after document, the General Assembly Hall gradually emptied. Ambassadors fled rather than hear more evidence of their nation's crimes. By the time he reached the most damning revelations, only African delegates and a handful of others remained. The UN's leadership had abandoned the building entirely, leaving subordinates to face the truth. The final documents Traoré presented were the most personal records of his own family. His grandfather had been assassinated by UN intelligence for opposing a mining operation. His father had been blacklisted from international opportunities for advocating African sovereignty. The UN had been monitoring Traoré himself since childhood, identifying him as a potential threat to their system. "They knew I would be here one day," Traoré said, holding up his own file. Document U2101. Subject Ibrahim Traoré assessment high risk to established order recommendation prevent rise to power through standard disruption protocols. Status: failed. The impact of Traoré's revelation was immediate and global. News organizations that tried to suppress the story found their own staff releasing it anyway. Social media platforms that attempted to block the documents discovered they had been simultaneously released on thousands of sites. The information cascade was unstoppable. Within hours, protests erupted at UN offices worldwide. African nations announced their withdrawal from UN programs. International courts were flooded with lawsuits. The Security Council permanent members faced demands for prosecution from their own citizens. The carefully constructed system of global governance began to collapse under the weight of its exposed crimes. The UN's response followed the protocol exactly as predicted. They denied, they delayed, they distracted. But Traoré had made the evidence impossible to ignore. Every denial was met with documented proof. Every delay was countered with public pressure. Every distraction was overshadowed by new revelations. As Traoré concluded his presentation, he made a final demand. The United Nations as constituted is a criminal organization that has committed crimes against humanity for 70 years. It must be dissolved. Its assets must be seized. Its perpetrators must be prosecuted. And Africa must receive reparations for 7 decades of systematic exploitation disguised as assistance. The silence that followed was deafening. Then slowly the African delegates began to applaud. They were joined by representatives from Latin America, Asia, and even some European nations. The applause grew into a standing ovation that lasted 10 minutes. When it ended, Traoré walked out of the General Assembly Hall, leaving behind a USB drive containing the complete archives. Within days, the documents had been analyzed by thousands of experts who confirmed their authenticity. The evidence was undeniable. The crimes were proven. The guilt was established. The United Nations, created supposedly to prevent the horrors of World War II, had instead perpetuated horrors against Africa that exceeded anything in human history. The legal proceedings that followed would take years, but the moral verdict was immediate. The UN had lost all legitimacy. Its agencies were disbanded or reconstituted under African leadership. Its peacekeeping forces were expelled from Africa. Its development programs were terminated. The architecture of exploitation that had been built over 70 years crumbled in weeks. The reparations negotiations were complex but necessary. The archives provided clear documentation of what had been stolen, destroyed, and prevented. The calculations showed that Africa was owed not billions but tens of trillions. The wealth that had been extracted, the development that had been prevented, the lives that had been lost, mafias, all had to be accounted for. But more important than money was the psychological liberation. Africans who had internalized narratives of inferiority discovered they had been deliberately programmed. Those who had accepted dependency learned it had been engineered. Those who had believed in their own inadequacy realized they had been sabotaged. The mental chains that had been stronger than physical ones were finally broken. The new international order that emerged from the ruins of the UN was fundamentally different. No longer would a few nations control global governance. No longer would Africa be subject to external management. No longer would exploitation be disguised as assistance. The world had to confront the reality that the system they had trusted had been criminal from its inception. President Traoré's courage in exposing the archives changed not just Africa but the entire global system. The boy from Butkenesu who had been marked as a threat by the UN had become the man who exposed their crimes and liberated a continent. His demand that the archives be opened and his revelation that he already had copies became the moment when African independence truly began. The documents Cartwright had risked everything to steal proved that conspiracy theories about global governance weren't theories but documented facts. The UN hadn't failed in its mission to promote peace and development. That had never been its true mission. Its real purpose, documented in its own archives, had been to maintain the colonial system through multilateral mechanisms that appeared legitimate. As investigations continued, more archives were discovered in other international organizations. The World Bank, the IMF, the W.H. Marlowe, all had similar documents revealing systematic exploitation disguised as development. The entire architecture of global governance had been designed to extract resources from the global south while maintaining the fiction of equality and assistance. The courage of one archivist who couldn't live with what he had discovered. And one president who dared to reveal it to the world had changed history. The truth that had been hidden for 70 years was finally exposed. The crimes that had been committed with impunity were finally prosecuted. And Africa, for the first time since the colonial era began, was truly free to determine its own destiny. The aftermath of Traoré's revelation triggered a cascade of whistleblowers from within the UN system who had been waiting for someone brave enough to break the silence. Within 48 hours of his speech, Sarah Mitchell, a senior coordinator at UNDP, who had worked in Africa for 15 years, came forward with her own cache of documents. She had been documenting the deliberate failure of development projects, keeping records of how successful initiatives were sabotaged when they threatened to make African nations self-sufficient. Her testimony revealed that there was an entire department within the UN dedicated to ensuring that development projects created dependency rather than independence. Mitchell's revelations were specific and damning. In Kenya, a water purification system that would have provided clean water to 5 million people was deliberately designed with components that would fail within 2 years and could only be replaced by a single supplier in Switzerland. When Kenyan engineers figured out how to manufacture replacement parts locally, UN officials threatened to withdraw all aid unless the government stopped the local production. The documents showed that this pattern was repeated in every African nation. Any attempt at technological independence was met with economic blackmail. The next whistleblower was Dr. James Okono, a Nigerian who had worked in the World Health Organization's African Regional Office. He revealed that the UN had been conducting medical experiments on African populations for decades under the guise of vaccination campaigns. These weren't conspiracy theories, but documented programs with code names, budgets, and progress reports. Operation Sterilist had tested fertility reduction drugs on women in 12 African countries without their knowledge. Project Mindbridge had used vaccines to deliver psychoactive compounds designed to reduce aggression and increase compliance in populations near resource extraction sites. Dr. Okono's most shocking revelation was the existence of biological libraries where the UN stored genetic material from African populations. These samples collected during vaccination campaigns and medical emergencies were being used to develop ethnic-specific biological weapons. The documents showed correspondence between UN officials and military researchers, discussing how to create diseases that would affect only people with certain African genetic markers. The goal was to have the capability to depopulate specific regions while leaving infrastructure intact for resource extraction. The financial records exposed by Thomas Lindbergh, a former UN controller, revealed the true scale of economic manipulation. The UN had been operating a shadow banking system that handled more money than many national economies. This system was used to launder money from resource extraction, fund coups and rebellions, and pay for assassinations and sabotage operations. The record showed that every UN Secretary General for the past 40 years had personal accounts containing hundreds of millions of dollars in these shadow banks, payment for their cooperation in maintaining the system. Lindbergh's documents also revealed the existence of economic hit protocols. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation wasn't caused by poor governance alone, but by a coordinated attack on its currency, orchestrated through UN financial mechanisms. Ghana's economic crisis in the 1980s was deliberately engineered to force the country to accept structural adjustment programs. Every African economic collapse in the past 50 years had fingerprints of UN manipulation in Lindbergh's records.
The technological suppression documented by Dr. Changi, a Chinese scientist who had worked in UN technology transfer programs, was even more extensive than initially revealed.
The UN had been actively preventing African nations from developing capabilities in critical areas like semiconductor manufacturing, pharmaceutical production, and renewable energy technology. When Nigerian scientists developed a revolutionary solar panel technology that was cheaper and more efficient than existing systems, the UN arranged for the laboratory to be destroyed in a terrorist attack and the lead scientists to die in accidents. Dr. Wei revealed that there was a classified list of technologies that African nations were never to be allowed to develop.
This included nuclear technology, even for power generation,
advanced telecommunications, satellite technology, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence.
Any African scientist who showed excellence in these fields was either recruited to work abroad or eliminated.
The brain drain from Africa wasn't natural migration, but a deliberate extraction of human capital to prevent technological development. The media manipulation went far deeper than previously understood. Jennifer Brooks, a former UN communications director, revealed that the organization had been running the largest propaganda operation in human history.
They didn't just influence media coverage.
They owned media companies, trained journalists, and created the narratives that the world accepted as truth about Africa. Every story about African poverty, conflict, and helplessness was part of a carefully crafted narrative designed to justify continued intervention and exploitation.
Brooks provided documents showing that the UN had a team of writers who created false stories about African atrocities that were then fed to international media as fact.
They had video production facilities that created fake footage of conflicts and humanitarian crisis. They had social media farms that shaped online discourse about Africa. The image of Africa that the world knew was largely fictional, created by UN propaganda to maintain support for their operations. The educational sabotage was more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Professor Maria Santos, who had designed educational curricula for UN programs in Africa, came forward with evidence that the educational systems imposed on African nations were specifically designed to prevent the emergence of critical thinking and innovation. The curricula emphasized rote memorization over analysis, obedience over creativity, and acceptance over questioning. Mathematical and scientific education was deliberately limited to basic levels, ensuring that Africans could operate imported technology but never innovate or improve upon it. Professor Santos revealed that there were secret assessments of African students who showed exceptional ability. These students were tracked, and if they couldn't be recruited to serve foreign interests, obstacles were placed in their path, scholarships were withdrawn, applications were lost, opportunities were blocked. The goal was to ensure that Africa's brightest minds either served the system or were prevented from challenging it. The environmental crimes exposed by Dr. Robert Harrison, a former UN Environmental Program Coordinator, showed that climate change was being weaponized against Africa. While publicly promoting environmental protection, the UN was secretly facilitating the dumping of toxic waste throughout Africa. They had designated certain African regions as sacrifice zones where environmental destruction was not just tolerated, but encouraged to make the land uninhabitable and force population displacement. Dr. Harrison's documents revealed that the UN knew about climate change's disproportionate impact on Africa decades ago and deliberately suppressed adaptation technologies that would have helped African nations cope. They wanted Africa to be devastated by climate change because environmental crisis provided justification for intervention and resource extraction. The Green Climate Fund, supposedly helping Africa adapt to climate change, was actually being used to fund projects that increased vulnerability to climate impacts. The religious manipulation was more extensive than initially revealed. Father Antonio Rossi, a Vatican liaison to UN humanitarian programs, came forward with evidence that religious organizations had been co-opted into the exploitation system. Churches, mosques, and traditional religious structures were infiltrated and used to promote doctrines of submission and acceptance. Religious leaders who preached resistance or self-determination were eliminated and replaced with those who would maintain the status quo. Father Rossi revealed that the UN had created entire religious movements designed to serve their purposes. These synthetic religions mixed traditional African beliefs with imported ideas that promoted fatalism and dependency. They taught that poverty was spiritual purification, that suffering was divine will, and that seeking change was sinful.
Millions of Africans had been indoctrinated into belief systems specifically designed to make them accept exploitation.
The depth of infiltration into African governments was exposed by Colonel Pierre Dumont, a French military officer who had been seconded to UN peacekeeping operations.
He revealed that the UN maintained files on every African politician documenting their weaknesses, vices, and secrets.
This information was used for blackmail and control. Those who couldn't be blackmailed were eliminated and replaced with those who could be controlled. Colonel Dumont provided organizational charts showing that key positions in most African governments were actually controlled by UN intelligence. Ministers of Finance, Defense, and Natural Resources were particularly targeted. These officials appeared to serve their nations, but were actually implementing UN directives. Every African government had been penetrated to some degree, with some being entirely controlled by UN operatives.
The covert military. Operations revealed by Dumont were staggering in scope.
The UN maintained private military companies that operated throughout Africa, conducting operations that ranged from assassinations to full-scale military campaigns. These forces were equipped with advanced weapons that were supposedly restricted by international treaties. They had conducted thousands of operations over decades, shaping African politics through violence while maintaining plausible deniability.
The biological warfare programs were more advanced than previously known.
Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese biologist who had worked in UN laboratories, revealed that diseases that had devastated Africa weren't natural, but had been deliberately created or modified.
Ebola outbreaks were triggered when population density in resource-rich areas became problematic. HIV/AIDS was allowed to spread unchecked in regions where population reduction was desired. Malaria prevention was deliberately sabotaged in areas slated for resource extraction.
Dr. Tanaka provided laboratory notebooks showing the development of pathogens designed specifically for African populations. These diseases were engineered to be difficult to treat with available medicines, forcing dependency on foreign medical aid. The UN controlled both the diseases and the cures, using them as tools of population management and control.
The psychological operations were more sophisticated than anyone had imagined.
Dr. Susan Chen, a psychiatrist who had worked on UN programs, revealed that entire populations had been subjected to psychological manipulation designed to create learned helplessness. Techniques developed in intelligence agencies were deployed on massive scales using everything from education to entertainment to shape African consciousness. Dr. Chen's documents showed that the UN had been using advanced neuroscience to understand how to break African resistance. They had identified neural pathways associated with pride, independence, and resistance and had developed interventions to suppress these traits. The goal was to create populations that were psychologically incapable of resistance, who would accept any treatment without question.
The cultural destruction was systematic and scientific.
Dr. Ahmed Hassan, an anthropologist who had worked for UNESCO, revealed that the UN had been deliberately destroying African cultural heritage while pretending to preserve it. They had been removing powerful cultural symbols, disrupting traditional knowledge transmission, and replacing authentic culture with manufactured traditions that promoted submission. Dr. Hassan provided inventories, showing that hundreds of thousands of African artifacts had been removed under the guise of preservation. Sacred objects that gave community strength and identity were taken to foreign museums or destroyed. Traditional knowledge about medicine, agriculture, and technology was documented and then suppressed, ensuring that Africans lost their indigenous
capabilities and became dependent on foreign knowledge.
The scope of surveillance revealed by Edward Kowalski, a former NSA contractor working with UN intelligence, showed that every electronic communication in Africa was monitored. The UN had built a surveillance network that tracked every phone call, email, text message, and internet search. This information was used to identify and eliminate threats to the system, to blackmail officials, and to manipulate public opinion.
Kowalski revealed that the UN had been using artificial intelligence to predict and prevent African resistance.
The AI systems could identify potential leaders before they emerged, detect organizing activities before they materialized, and disrupt movements before they formed. Any African who showed signs of independent thinking or leadership potential was flagged and monitored with interventions deployed to prevent their rise.
The economic espionage was total.
Every African business of significance was penetrated by UN intelligence. Trade secrets were stolen and given to foreign competitors.
Successful African companies were sabotaged or forced to sell to foreign interests.
Innovation was detected and suppressed or stolen.
The African economy wasn't just exploited.
It was actively prevented from developing. The legal system manipulation revealed by Justice Catherine Wanjiru, a Kenyan judge who had worked with UN legal programs, showed that African legal systems had been deliberately corrupted to prevent justice. Laws were written with loopholes that protected foreign exploitation.
Judges were bribed, blackmailed, or eliminated.
Cases that threatened foreign interests never reached trial or were decided in favor of exploiters.
Justice Wero revealed that the UN maintained a secret court system that overruled African courts when necessary. This shadow legal system could override national sovereignty, declaring African laws invalid if they threatened foreign interests.
Every attempt by African nations to assert legal control over their resources had been subverted by this parallel legal structure.
The manipulation of international law was equally shocking.
Professor David Miller, who had worked on international legal frameworks at the UN, revealed that international law itself had been written to legitimize exploitation.
Treaties were designed with hidden provisions that stripped African sovereignty.
International courts were structured to ensure that African nations could never win cases against powerful countries.
The entire framework of international law was a cage designed to trap Africa in perpetual subordination. The control over humanitarian aid was absolute.
Every calorie of food aid, every dose of medicine, every tent and blanket was tracked and used as a tool of control. Aid was withheld from populations that showed resistance and concentrated in areas that complied. Humanitarian crisis was not just exploited but manufactured to create dependency and justify intervention. The documents revealed contingency plans for every scenario. If African nations united, there were plans to create conflicts between them. If a leader emerged who couldn't be controlled, there were multiple assassination protocols. If a technology was developed that threatened the system, there were sabotage procedures. If information leaked, there were disinformation campaigns ready. The system had been designed to be self-protecting and self-perpetuating. The most chilling discovery was the final protocol, a plan for the complete depopulation of Africa if the exploitation system ever faced existential threat. This protocol, updated annually, included provisions for releasing engineered diseases, poisoning water supplies, and triggering conflicts that would eliminate most of Africa's population while preserving infrastructure for resource extraction.
The plan was detailed with timelines, resource allocations, and expected casualty figures.
The nuclear dimension was particularly terrifying. The UN had secretly built nuclear weapons facilities in several African countries without the knowledge of their governments.
These weapons were not for African defense, but to be used against African populations if necessary. The facilities were controlled by foreign personnel and could be activated remotely. Africa was essentially held hostage by nuclear weapons on its own soil. The space program suppression revealed that several African nations had been developing space capabilities that was sabotaged by the UN. Nigeria's satellite program faced mysterious failures that were actually sabotaged. South Africa's space launch capability was destroyed through coordinated economic and technical attacks. The UN had determined that African nations must never achieve independent access to space, as satellite technology would reveal the extent of resource extraction and provide communication systems that couldn't be controlled. The genetic warfare programs were genocidal in scope. The UN had been collecting genetic data from every African ethnic group, creating a database that could be used to develop ethnic-specific weapons. They had identified genetic markers unique to specific groups and developed pathogens that would target these markers. The capability existed to eliminate entire ethnic groups while leaving others unaffected. The time manipulation sounds like science fiction, but was documented in the archives. The UN had been conducting experiments in perception manipulation using electromagnetic fields and chemical compounds to alter how populations perceive time. The goal was to make suffering seem shorter and exploitation seem natural by manipulating temporal perception. Entire populations had been subjected to these experiments without their knowledge.
The quantum computing facilities revealed by Dr. Hans Müller, a physicist who had worked on UN technology programs, showed capabilities that weren't supposed to exist. The UN had quantum computers that could break any encryption, predict social movements with near certainty, and model intervention strategies with perfect accuracy. These computers were used to maintain absolute information superiority over African nations. The weather modification capabilities were more advanced than previously revealed.
The UN could create hurricanes, trigger earthquakes, and generate tsunamis.
They had used these capabilities to destroy African coastal cities that were becoming too prosperous, to trigger famines by disrupting rainfall, and to make certain regions uninhabitable. Climate change was real, but much of Africa's climate disaster was artificially created. The dimensional research sounds impossible, but was documented in classified annexes. The UN had been researching parallel dimensions where Africa's resources could be extracted without dealing with populations. They had been trying to develop technology to shift resources between dimensions, essentially stealing from infinite Africas across infinite realities. The experiments had failed, but the attempt showed the lengths they would go to for exploitation. The resistance networks that had operated despite this total surveillance deserved recognition. For decades, African patriots had maintained underground networks that preserved true history, protected targeted individuals, and prepared for the day when truth could be revealed. These networks operated without electronic communication, using traditional methods that couldn't be monitored. They had preserved evidence, protected witnesses, and maintained hope despite overwhelming odds.
The role of the African diaspora was crucial, but hidden.
Africans living abroad had been secretly supporting resistance networks, gathering intelligence, and preserving evidence. They had used their access to foreign systems to document crimes and prepare for eventual revelation. Many had sacrificed careers and safety to serve the liberation struggle from within enemy territory. The impact of Traoré's revelation continued to ripple outward. Every day brought new whistleblowers, new documents, new revelations. The UN building in New York was surrounded by protesters demanding justice. The Security Council permanent members faced revolution from their own citizens, horrified by what had been done in their names. The carefully constructed world order was collapsing under the weight of its exposed crimes.
The trials that began in Ouagadougou were unprecedented in scope. The African Justice Tribunal established to prosecute crimes revealed in the archives had jurisdiction over anyone involved in the exploitation system regardless of nationality or position.
Former UN officials, heads of state, corporate executives, and military officers were arrested and brought to trial. The principle of sovereign immunity was rejected for crimes against humanity. The evidence presented at trials was overwhelming. Videos of officials laughing about African deaths, documents ordering assassinations, financial records of theft, medical data from illegal experiments. The defendants' attempts to justify their actions only revealed the depth of their moral corruption. They spoke of African lives as statistics, of suffering as acceptable costs, of exploitation as natural order. The testimonies of survivors transformed abstract crimes into human reality. Mothers whose children had been sterilized without consent.
Fathers whose sons had been disappeared for showing leadership.
Communities that had been deliberately infected with diseases. Families that had lost everything to manufactured crisis.
Each story added weight to the mounting evidence of systematic genocide disguised as assistance. The reparations calculations were staggering. Economists calculated that Africa was owed at least $100 trillion for 70 years of exploitation. This included not just stolen resources, but lost development, destroyed lives, and prevented prosperity. The amount was more than the entire global economy, showing that Africa's poverty was actually the foundation of global wealth. The recovery process would take generations. The psychological damage from decades of manipulation couldn't be healed quickly. The economic structures built for exploitation had to be completely replaced. The educational systems designed to limit African potential had to be rebuilt from scratch. The health systems that had been used for experimentation had to be transformed into genuine care providers. But the liberation was real. For the first time in centuries, Africa was free to determine its own destiny.
The chains that had been invisible were broken. The exploitation that had seemed natural was ended. The future that had been stolen was being reclaimed. The revelation of the UN archives had triggered not just political change, but psychological revolution.
The new international order that emerged was based on genuine equality rather than disguised exploitation.
The UN was dissolved and replaced with regional organizations that had no hierarchy, no permanent members, no veto powers.
Resource extraction required genuine consent and fair compensation. Technology transfer was mandatory and unconditional.
The architecture of exploitation was replaced with structures of genuine cooperation. The impact on global consciousness was profound. People worldwide realized they had been complicit in genocide through their ignorance and indifference. The comfortable assumption that international organizations were benign was shattered. The belief that poverty was natural rather than manufactured was destroyed.
Humanity had to confront the reality that it had tolerated and supported systematic evil for decades. President Trudeau's courage in revealing the archives changed not just Africa but humanity itself.
The young man from Burkina Faso who had demanded the archives be opened had triggered a revolution in human consciousness.
His simple act of presenting evidence had destroyed a system that
had seemed invincible. His courage had inspired others to speak truth regardless of consequences.
The transformation continued beyond politics and economics into the realm of human possibility.
Africa, freed from systematic suppression, began to flourish in ways that had been prevented for centuries.
Innovation exploded as brilliant minds were no longer suppressed. Culture flowered as authentic expression was no longer forbidden.
Prosperity spread as resources were no longer stolen. The world watched in amazement as Africa freed from exploitation achieved in years what had been denied for centuries. Technologies that had been suppressed were developed and surpassed. Cities that had been deliberately impoverished became centers of innovation. Populations that had been designated for elimination became leaders of human advancement.
The lesson was clear. Human potential was unlimited when not artificially suppressed.
Africa's rapid advancement after liberation proved that poverty was never natural, but always manufactured. The continent that had been portrayed as hopeless became the hope of humanity. The people who had been designated as inferior proved themselves superior to their oppressors in every measure that mattered.